It's a great pleasure to see you here again. First of all, I want to thank Avital Magalis for arranging this here, and I also want to thank Yad Harav Nissim for allowing us, for giving us the opportunity to make use of this Beit Midrash. Special Baruch haba, first of all, to my dear friend Professor William Kolbrener, the other rabbi, or better, the other professor is just walking in, Professor Elliott Malamet, and also a good friend. Baruch haba to you. Hi. Tonight we are celebrating a book by Professor Kolbrener, which you see over here, The Last Rabbi. It's quite a title. Professor Kolbrener is a professor of English at Bar Ilan University, an expert in Milton, and he has lately written a lot of very important stuff on the Jewish tradition, and this book is one of them. A remarkable book, as you will find out. Professor Elliott Malamet, sitting next to him, is a lecturer of Jewish studies and English literature. I'm not sure if you are still at the University of Toronto. You still are?
No.
No, in Bar Ilan University. Hebrew.
Yeah.
Also written a lot on the Jewish tradition in very unconventional ways. I just want to remind you of two things. I put on your chair this prayer. Please take it home. Make use of it. I wrote this prayer because I believe it is high time that we should say something for the non-Jewish world besides for ourselves. And if you are able to be mishachnea, as they say in Hebrew, to get your rabbi or the kabbaim to say it perhaps after the Mishberg or for the chayalim in the shuls, please do so. I have a hard time to sell this to them, but perhaps you do better than I do. Interestingly, the Reform community took it straight away in saying it, the conservative community is saying it, churches wrote me that they are saying it, and the Orthodox are not saying it. Friends, about 35 years ago, a very famous professor who is no longer alive, a fantastic personality by the name of Professor Emil Fackenheim. I'm sure you have heard all about him. The professor who was known for his many writings about the Holocaust, and an Heschel expert, and also specifically about the Jewish tradition. He just had at that time published a book which you may know, it's a great book to read, which is called To Mend the World, Foundations of Future Jewish Thought. And the conference took place at the Hebrew University, and I was there myself. There were about 1,000 people sitting in the room. And the person who was to critique this book by Emil Fackenheim was nobody less but the famous Yeshayahu Leibowitz, the l'enfant terrible of the religious Israeli world, an Ilui in every sense of the word. So Leibowitz got up, I saw this myself, I was there, and he said, Professor Fackenheim was sitting next to him, and he said, Professor Fackenheim, I must tell you something. I did not read your book. And we were all taken, obviously, totally back, and we couldn't believe our ears. And then he said, you probably wonder why I did not read your book when I'm here to critique it. Typically Leibowitz. And he said the following words. The first thing what I do when I get a book to read, I read the footnotes. If I like the footnotes, I read the book. If I don't like the footnotes, I don't read the book. Professor Fackenheim, I did not like your footnotes. And I tell you why. And he was right about that, Leibowitz. He said, because all your footnotes indicate that you did not make use of the original rabbinical sources. You took from Martin Buber, you took from Franz Rosenzweig. When you quote a Rashi, it comes from Franz Rosenzweig, Martin Buber, about Midrashim and things like this. This is not for me. I did therefore not read the book. And he sat down. And I shall not tell you what happened afterwards.
You're not going to do that now.
Wait a moment. What do you think I'm introducing? So, Professor Kolbrener, I only read your footnotes. But the reason is different from in the case of Leibowitz. As you know, my wife has not been well, has been in hospital, and I was not able to read the book properly. But I liked the footnotes. I believe actually, when reading a little bit here and there through the book, this is a most remarkable book, and I'm not saying this because the professor is sitting next to me, but because it is something of a totally different quality than anything I've read about Rav Soloveitchik. And I think by now, too many books have been published about Rabbi Soloveitchik. This is an exceptional case, worthwhile, not an easy reading. I will leave the praise and the critique to Elliott and the two professors together to discuss this book and to explain you what this book is all about. But before I do that, I want to take about 20 minutes to tell you what I think of Rabbi Soloveitchik. And that is this. I never met Rabbi Soloveitchik, to my great, great regret. I didn't learn in Yeshiva University. I went to Haredi Yeshivot in England, basically, and later here in the Mirror Yeshiva here in Mea Shearim. But I think that I read all his books. First of all his books on Jewish philosophy, and I even read some of his Halakhic works, the Londes, as they say, the Lamdanut, of his Gemara Shiurim, which were all very fascinating, no doubt. That he was a Gadol Hador, there's no doubt about it. He was an exceptional great man, towering figure, with an output of writing which is unbelievable. How the man had the time to do so, besides all his learning, is indeed incredibly impressive. But, and I hope you hear well what I say, he was not a Mechadesh. And I tell you what I mean by that. He was not a Mechadesh, meaning to say, to think in novel terms, when it came to huge Halakhic problems. There he was a traditionalist, like all the Osir Poskim. And perhaps even more than some of the Osir Poskim. And I'll tell you in a moment why I say this. And he did not move the Halakhic tradition forward in a way which I had hoped he would do. And that's very strange. And I'll tell you why. Because if anybody wrote about the Halakha, it was Rabbi Soloveitchik. Truth about it is, if you look into the Jewry of America, in these days before Rabbi Soloveitchik came on the scenery, nobody wrote a word about Halakha. I'm speaking here about the Orthodox community. They were writing about Jewish philosophy, about the Nevi'im, about prophecy. They were writing about universalism, all the beautiful things about the Jewish tradition, but nobody touched, in philosophical terms, the concept of Halakha. And there was a very good reason for that. And that is that really the Orthodox community was embarrassed about Halakha. Why was it embarrassed about the Halakha? Because they did not know how to explain this strange phenomenon called Halakha, which makes problems out of every little issue. I once said to my students, the Halakha is the art of making a problem out of every solution. And I think that's true. But who was going to explain that, why that is? And Rabbi Soloveitchik took on that task. And he did a marvelous job. First of all, I come to that in a moment, in his Halakhic man, Ish HaHalakha. But for the rest, there was complete silence in this field. And Rabbi Soloveitchik broke through, and he single-handed, I would say, created a discussion about the world of halakha like nobody else had done. And today, because of him, there's no doubt about that, we don't only have Orthodox halakha, we have conservative halakha, we have reform halakha, we have reconstructionist halakha. Suddenly it became a major issue. But he was the man who put the halakha on the table. And that's remarkable, and I'll tell you why. Because it is nearly contradictory. While he wrote so much beautiful things about the halakha in philosophical and ideological terms, when it came to the application of halakha, he did not move anything. He was the ultimate conservative Halakhic authority, especially within the modern Orthodox world. So he was not a Machadesh in that sense of the word. He was what in the yeshiva world we call a maspir. He was an ultimate great exponent of what this Judaism was all about. The beauty by which he writes, the English in which he writes, which was not even his original home language, is outstanding. It is dazzling in every sense of the word. And what he did, and only he could do that basically, was he used philosophical ideas coming from the non-Jewish world, psychology, philosophy, literature, whatever he could get his hands on, and he moved that into his understanding of what this halakha was all about, and by that he did a phenomenal job. The only also person I can think about who also did something like that, but in very different terminologies and in a very different way, was Abraham Joshua Heschel. Also a very famous Jewish philosopher, but of a totally different background, Hasidic background, and as you know, Soloveitchik came from a real Lithuanian Jewish background. Personally, but that is a personal observation, Heschel speaks more to me than Rabbi Soloveitchik, but that's a different story, which perhaps in also time I will speak about. For the rest, Rav Soloveitchik, from all the writings, and I've also been speaking with Rabbi Norman Lamb about this, and also people, he was an old-fashioned Rosh Yeshiva, running basically Yeshiva University. He was a brisker, as we call him, and if I think and I read his Chidushim and Gemara and so on, that was nothing different from what I heard from my Rosh Yeshivot in Gateshead Yeshiva, Haredi Yeshiva at the time, two tremendous great Reb Leib Gurewitz and Reb Leib Lapjen at the time, from whom I have Selicha. They wrote exactly in the same tradition as Rav Soloveitchik. Rav Soloveitchik was there not at all something special. To tell you honestly, the truth is, I sometimes heard Chidushim of Rav Soloveitchik, but they were always said in the name of Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, because since Rav Soloveitchik himself was a Zionist, he was not mentioned in Gateshead Yeshiva. More interesting was that he did not see himself at all as a posek. If you would ask him, what are you? He would say, I'm a Malamet. I'm a Malamet. I'm basically a teacher. That's what he saw himself. The only difference I would say is that Rav Soloveitchik definitely saw there were moral problems within the halakha. He realized there were issues there which really needed to be tackled. Women's issues, the mamzer problem, the aguna problem, problems which at the moment we are speaking a lot about within this community over here. But he did not solve these problems. He did not do anything about it. He left it for what it was. He was very conventional. In fact, I know this from first hand, he was more conventional about some of these issues than Reb Moshe Feinstein. David Hartman, the famous, unusual David Hartman, in a book of his called The God Who Hates Lies, you mentioned it as well, writes over there that there was a case of a Gioret, convert, who wanted to marry a Kohen, a priest. And you know that the halakha is that a Kohen can't marry a Gioret. And Rav Soloveitchik, when he got this couple in front of him, sent them home and said, I can't do anything for you. I know personally from the Talmidim of Reb Moshe Feinstein, and actually twice I used it and gave a chuppah because of that. Reb Moshe Feinstein was of the opinion that you could marry these people most of the time, when there was in the family a break as far as Shemirat HaMitzvot was concerned. If an older generation stopped to be Shomer Mitzvot, he would say then you can't rely anymore on the Kohanut of these people, and he would permit them to get married. Twice I have made use of that heter after I discussed this with some great question. And the case of Rav Soloveitchik, which is mentioned by David Hartman, was a similar case, also where there was a break in the tradition. And interestingly enough, and I have no answer, I'm actually standing with my back against the wall, Rav Soloveitchik was not prepared to give a chuppah, and Kiddushin did not allow it to happen. To me, this is a pella, as they say in Hebrew. This is astonishing, because he did not see himself as a posek, and he lived in the same days as Reb Moshe Feinstein, and he must have known about this. Big puzzle. There is another man with whom we had a major difference of opinion. That was the famous Rav Emanuel Rachman, the head of Bar Ilan University, who I personally knew as well. Very interesting man, very innovative. And one of the many differences of opinion which he had with Rabbi Soloveitchik was about indeed the case of the status of women within Jewish halakha. In short, I won't go into the details over here. There's a concept within the Gemara which we call taf lemetaf, which means to say this: it is better to live, speaking about women, it is better to live as two together than to live alone. Meaning to say that a woman, in according to the Gemara, would always prefer to be married, even when it is the wrong person, even when she doesn't like him. As long as she is married, she will prefer that over being alone. And Rav Soloveitchik understood that to be a chazaka, that is to say, an absolute fact which cannot be challenged at all. And Rav Rachman was of the opinion, which I personally agree with, that this is purely an historical fact, which at the time of the Gemara was indeed the case. But today, if you would ask women, are you prepared to live with somebody you don't like? The Gemara gives many different unpleasant examples of that. Would you be prepared to do that? And a woman would say, definitely no, I better be single and be alone. And Rav Rachman therefore had a major difference of opinion with Rav Soloveitchik about that. And as Hartman writes, David Hartman writes, what Rav Soloveitchik did was, he made it, and I quote here David Hartman, it into a permanent ontological principle. That is to say, there is no such thing as a woman not wanting to be married, even when it is to the wrong person. This has all sort of effects in halakha, which I won't go into now. And Rav Rachman said, I absolutely disagree. And then, very interesting, in an article of Rav Rachman, he tells there the story that he met about this matter with Rav Soloveitchik. And Rav Soloveitchik said the following words to him, I quote, Rachman, speaking to the younger Rachman, you may be right and I may be wrong. You view the halakha historically, and I like to view it meta-historically. Two different opinions about this particular matter. In other words, Rav Soloveitchik made into some kind of an ideal, and above the presumption of fact, even when the facts are different from what the halakha says, he was of the opinion that the chazaka should continue to be applied today like it did a few thousand years ago. Very strange, to be quite honest. And with all respect to Rav Soloveitchik, I do not understand it, especially because Rav Soloveitchik did not see himself as a posek. So why was he, especially when he already said that Rabbi Rachman was probably right, not prepared to go along with that? And then, being Rav Soloveitchik, he could have done wonders for women, and he didn't. Compare Rav Soloveitchik with somebody else who I tremendously admire. I never met. That was Eliezer Berkowitz. The famous Rabbi Berkowitz, who lived the last few years here in this city. He was a Talmud Mufhak of the 3-day Eish, the famous Rav Yechiel Weinberg, who in my days in Europe was considered to be the posek, the Halakhic authority. Rav Berkowitz maintains, very interesting, that since the establishment of the State of Israel, the halakha has to undergo, Orthodox halakha has to undergo tremendous changes because the halakha had been developed in the last 2000 years within exile and was responding to exile conditions. And he said, and I quote here what he said halakha became defensive. It had to build huge walls around it to hold ourselves away from the non-Jews, an anti-Semitic world, making sure that we hold together, we will not assimilate. And says Rav Berkowitz, but that time is over with the establishment of Medinat Israel. We are now an independent people and we should take these walls down. And he wrote a fantastic book about that. It is in Hebrew, but it was also translated in short in English, which is called Halakha Kocha V'Tafkida. The halakha, its strengths and its purpose. I think in English it is called not from heaven. Very worthwhile reading. And he's making there the point that the halakha has been for the last 2000 years in a waiting mode. Basically waiting to get out of its own exile condition and becoming itself again, liberate itself from all the problems which it had to build because of the exile situation. But, says Berkowitz, this time is over. He dealt with Shemitah. By the way, believed that we should do away with Shemitah nearly altogether and not doing all these strange things which we are now doing by selling land and things like that, which is halachically highly problematic. The whole story is highly problematic. He had the most unusual ideas about Giur, how we deal today with a few 100,000 people walking around here in the State of Israel, and how can we megayer them even when they won't keep all the mitzvot. He wrote about the status of women. He wrote about the agunot, and some of the Gedolei Hador at the time were prepared to go along, how to free these particular women. He wrote about the mamzer. He wrote about many very, very interesting things, and he made a major breakthrough. But he was unknown within the Orthodox world. Tremendous Talmid Chacham, by the way. There was another person, another few people I need to mention, and that is a whole story on its own. If you look into the Sephardi Halakhic world, you will find there people who are in the Ashkenazi world completely unknown, who were tremendous great Halakhic personalities, and did more or less the same what Rav Berkowitz did. That was first of all the famous Chacham ben Zion Uziel, the chief rabbi of Israel in the days of Rav Kook. It was afterwards Rav Yosef Mashash, who was the chief rabbi of Haifa, unbelievable halakhic authority, who had the most daring ways how to deal with halakha. And there was one Ashkenazi which is completely unknown, definitely in the yeshiva world. I never heard about him, I just read all his Tishuot, they were just republished, and that was Reb Chaim Hirschenson. Very remarkable man, not only in halakha, but also in Jewish philosophy. Clearly first-class Talmid Chacham, who tried to respond to the issues of today, specifically in the State of Israel. All these people are more or less unknown, besides Rav Soloveitchik. The only other person I could mention, as you know, is obviously Rav Kook, who was very much known. And while Rav Kook had a philosophy, a complicated philosophy about halakha, and definitely wanted to move in different directions, when it came to Psak Din, he stayed the old-fashioned posek. The same thing. I discussed that with several of his Talmidim, and they all said that was a strange thing. There was really two different Rav Kooks. There was the philosopher, Rav Kook, and on the other side there was the pure halachist, called Rav Kook. When this book of Rav Soloveitchik was published, the Halakhic Man, which I think was originally first written in German and then translated into English many years later, they brought this book to Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was at that time a professor of Jewish philosophy and of mysticism at the Jewish Theological Seminar, himself a tremendous Talmid Chacham, and he lived more or less an Orthodox life. And they had asked him about this. What do you think about this book, The Halakhic Man of Rav Soloveitchik? Here is what Heschel said. That is the way how people wrote it down. If that's completely correct, I don't know, but it's interesting. They wrote in the name of Professor Heschel, I should say Rabbi Heschel, the following words. Ish ha-halacha, the halakhic man, lo haya velo nifra ela mashal haya. There was never such a Jew called an halakhic man. Soloveitchik's study, so brilliant, is based on the false notion that the Jewish tradition is a cold, logical affair with no room for piety. These are quite strong words here. After all, the Torah does say, love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and might. No, said Heschel, there was never such a typology in the Jewish tradition as the halakhic man. There was and is an ish Torah, not an ish halacha. A man of Torah who combines halacha and akadah, is very strong with Heschel, but that is an also matter altogether. That was the critique of Heschel, and very interesting. The former chief rabbi of England, Jonathan Sachs, in a hesped which he gave on Rav Soloveitchik, writes that when Rav Soloveitchik saw the book of Heschel called the Shabbat, which by the way you must read, it's a beautiful work, and there he said, Halacha is not poetry. Heschel had turned the whole of Shabbat into an incredible poetry, unbelievable and the way how he wrote that. But for me, the halacha is first of all the lamatet melachot, the 39 forms of work which are not permitted to be done on Shabbat. So here you have two totally different kibunim about the same topic, Shabbat, halacha, and so on. And we can only say Elu Elu Divrei Elokim Chayim. Both tremendously great people. The earlier mentioned poskim, which I just mentioned, like Rav Hirschenson and the Sephardi poskim and Eliezer Berkowitz, they sold out of the box when it came to practical halacha. There is little of that to be found within the writings, the practical halacha, in the writings of Rav Soloveitchik. I don't know, it seems that he did not realize what Rav Berkowitz had said, and that is that it has become defensive, and that it was waiting to be liberated. That never came up. But can you just imagine, if he would have accepted that point of view, what Rav Soloveitchik, in his incredible brilliance, greatness, would have been able to do practically for the halacha when it came to women and to many other matters. Truth is, in my opinion, I don't know if the professors will agree with me, from what I read is that once Rav Soloveitchik wrote all these beautiful, fantastic, great things about the halacha, he also withdrew behind the halacha, the conventional halacha, and left it for what it was. He did not go the way of Berkowitz, Rav Uziel, and all the other people. And I think that because of that, modern Orthodoxy got into problems. My personal opinion, modern Orthodoxy is outdated. And I say this with great pain, because I would have liked to say something different. But I think it has something to do with the fact that it ultimately was not prepared to solve some of the major halachic problems and fell back on the old traditional points of view without taking into account what Berkowitz, Chacham Uziel and others had been writing. There was no breakthrough with Rav Soloveitchik, and there is nearly no breakthrough within the modern Orthodox community. There are exceptions, no doubt, especially here in Israel, but in America it is a little different. One last word, which may be harsh to say, that I say it with great respect. I think there is an unhealthy obsession with Rav Soloveitchik within the modern Orthodox community. It touches on, forgive me, Avodah Zarah. The man became an idol. It nearly became a cult. I've been several times in Yeshiva University, I've even taught there. Rav Soloveitchik was seen nearly like an idol. He was the last word about everything and anything. I can tell you, when I learned in Gateshead Yeshiva, big Rosh Yeshivot, there was no such thing. We had tremendous respect for our Rosh Yeshivot, but we would disagree with them. There was no such thing as people saying das Teure, as they call it today, that everything suddenly becomes a Halakhic matter which people just can decide. Didn't exist in my days. We went for an eitzah, we went for a request and advice from our Rosh Yeshivot, but it was not taken to the point that we made idols out of him. My impression when I read, when I speak with people in that community, that this was going a little too far in the case of Rav Soloveitchik, which I'm sure was the last thing he wanted himself. And he himself was living in tension. He was a split personality. On one side, he was the man of the old-fashioned brisker method of learning Gemara, and he did that phenomenally well. And at the same time, he was taken by modern conditions, the modern world, philosophy, especially German philosophy, and he tried to bring them together, and I think he got stuck in the middle of all of it, and did not know what to do, and therefore, indeed, became a person who I think was pained by the fact that he could not overcome this incredible, difficult situation. He tried, but I don't think he actually succeeded. Flexibility on one side, fundamentalism on the other side, were built in his personality. If you have seen the movie about his life, you see it clearly there coming up as well. But the greatest thing about him is, no doubt, that he laid the foundations of the theology of Halakha, no doubt. He did tremendous great for modern Orthodoxy. But I think we should have to temper a little bit his authority in this respect and allow other people to speak, such as Rav Berkowitz, such as Rav Weinberg, such as Rav Chacham Ben Zion Uziel, Rav Yosef Mashas, and even the more radical Emanuel Ruckman. They got less attention, and I'll tell you one thing why that is as well, in my humble opinion. They were not called Soloveitchik. The Soloveitchik name was already so much established since Reb Chaim Soloveitchik and his father, Reb Moshe Soloveitchik, that by having that name alone, it gave him an authority which the others who were not called by that name just did not ever have. And that's a great, great pity. And we must make sure that indeed, because of that very reason, we give the authors a chance as much as we give a chance to Rav Soloveitchik. Once more, I've said this in great respect of him. I am an ultimate great admirer of him, but at the same time, we need to think this all a little bit more over in ways that we see more balance in what is happening today within the modern Orthodox community. I thank you very much. There is one thing which I did not mention, and I should mention, and that this evening is organized not just by the David Cardozo Academy, but also by Torah in Motion, which is Professor Elliott, Malamet, his community or his special academy, mainly in Toronto, but we are trying to do together things over here because in many ways we have a similar attitude to certain issues. If we have about this issue, I have no idea.
You ready? Ready to rock? Hi, good evening. I'm Dr. Elliott Malamet, and as Rabbi Cardozo said, on behalf of the Cardozo Academy and also Torah in Motion, welcome. It's really my pleasure to be in conversation once again with William Kolbrener, who's a professor of English literature at Bar Ilan. He's the author of Milton's Warring Angels, as well as work on Mary Astle. He's also the author of Open-Minded Torah, on irony, fundamentalism, and love. His latest book, The Last Rabbi, Joseph Soloveitchik and the Talmudic Tradition, was published a few months ago by Indiana University Press. It is a complex, difficult, and unique deconstruction of the topic, and I hope you enjoy the conversation. Please welcome William Kolbrener. You know, Bill, you've written a lot of articles on Jewish topics, but here you've devoted yourself full length to Rabbi Soloveitchik. I'm interested in, A, why you're interested in writing on him, particularly in the kind of way that you do, And I'm also intrigued by the fact that unlike much writing on him, you're not a student. You didn't attend Yeshiva University, you weren't part of that orbit, and you're offering a very different kind of lens on his work. So maybe you can take us a little bit through your thinking about why you wanted to write on this and in this way.
Well, as Elliott mentioned, when I was in graduate school, I was a graduate student in English literature, and I was very interested at the time in questions of pluralism and interpretive authority. That is, I'm writing about Milton in the 17th century. Milton is writing at a revolutionary period. There is a burst of energy related to individualism, and there's a question about how this individualism can be contained. I'm also at graduate school at Columbia in the 1980s. It's the time of high theory. Theorists, cultural critics are also thinking about the relationship between individualism and community, the way in which multiple meanings can survive in a community, or whether community can survive multiple kinds of meanings. And I remember going to a Beit Midrash with a friend of mine, and it was Chaim Berlin in Brooklyn. We sat down to learn Gemara, and I thought, these people are totally crazy. Because there was no methodological introduction to what was happening. Subsequently, I found a book by Rabbi Soloveitchik called Halakhic Man. And from that point on, I realized there was a person within the Jewish tradition who spoke the languages with which I was familiar. So through my engagement with his work, I began to address the very questions that I thought about in graduate school: pluralism, multiplicity, possibilities of multiple interpretation in relationship to Talmudic tradition and Talmudic argument. So I wrote many arguments on Talmudic hermeneutics. That's Talmudic interpretation, how to understand the principle that Rabbi Cardozo mentioned. These and these are the words of the living God, which by any philosophical standard doesn't really make any sense. And from there, I went on to write about Rabbi Soloveitchik's work. And I tried, or thought at the time, about writing a book that would show the continuity between Talmudic thought about interpretation and Rabbi Soloveitchik's thought about interpretation. I think we'll probably flesh that out a little bit more later. The question about not being a Yeshiva University student. There's something to be said for being within the hermeneutic circle. That is, inside, to be an insider. And as I tell my students, whenever we study Milton or Aeschylus or Virgil, the hermeneutics of suspicion, that is an interpretive perspective which claims somehow that the critic knows more than the author, is a last-ditch resort. Meaning we want to spend many, many hours, many days, many months, many years being on the inside and seeing things from an insider perspective. From one perspective, I revere the person who goes by the name of the Rav. And my family is here in Jerusalem, and I live here and work here in Israel, in many ways on account of that original engagement with Rav Soloveitchik. But during the course of my engagement with Rav Soloveitchik, and perhaps in trying to write a book that I never wrote, which would find the continuity between Talmudic tradition and Rabbi Soloveitchik on questions of knowledge and interpretation, instead of finding continuity, I found a kind of rupture. I found a kind of discontinuity. And I found really that I found myself addressing Rabbi Soloveitchik not as the Rav, and not even as Rabbi Soloveitchik, but as Soloveitchik. And it's not really, I think, in this room, and in me speaking as a professor, which is what I am, a sign of disrespect. To me, Soloveitchik is one of the major theologians of the 20th century. And I think by calling him only the Rav, and even the way he's published only by his students, does in a way a disservice to his reputation. Because instead of engaging with him critically, like we would any other great figure, there is a sense that when you're inside, there is that, Rabbi Cardozo calls it idolatry, but that reverence. I think also what gets left out, and I did not experience this firsthand, is that Rabbi Soloveitchik's charisma was extraordinary, and he had an extraordinary effect upon his listeners. So in some sense, in answer to your question, I think I'm at an advantage having not been a student of the Rav. It's like saying Paradise Lost should only be read by Puritans. The best critics of Milton's Paradise Lost happen to be Jews. And it may just be because they have a distance from the work that people who are inside don't have. And I think where there perhaps is an impulse for apologetics to try to make sense of things or to try to whitewash things, a more honest, and I will not say objective, but an outsider's view, using languages outside of the languages that Rabbi Soloveitchik uses, I think are elucidative. And my not being at YU in that sense, again, I think was an advantage in that I was not part of that circle. And I think my book is complicated because some of the chapters are really written from the perspective of being inside the hermeneutic circle. The second half of the book is clearly not.
Let's pick up on some of the threads of what you're saying here. One of them being that what makes this book different is that it weaves together and employs multiple kinds of discourses that you almost never see in traditional books about traditional Jewish figures. And I mean by that, it's weaving in psychoanalysis, complex literary theory, and certain kinds of philosophical schools of thought, and actually trying to bring them into some kind of conversation with Rabbi Soloveitchik. But at the heart of the matter to me, and I actually did read the book, is that the key theme of the book is adopted from an essay by Freud in 1917, which is called Mourning and Melancholia. And in your introduction, you refer to Rabbi Soloveitchik as a melancholy modern, right, which is a very striking phrase. A melancholy modern as opposed to what you call the mourning rabbis of the Talmud. So what I'd like you to do is take us through and explain what is, first of all, Freud referring to in this binary between mourning and melancholy, and how you've adopted this for the work on a 20th century Orthodox rabbi.
Well, Freud wrote the essay 1915, which was in the middle of World War I. And for him, the essay Mourning and Melancholy, like subsequent essays that he would write during that decade, was really a form of mourning for a civilization that he felt was about to be lost. So although he's writing clearly in psychoanalytic terms about family relationships and family dynamics, it's also a form of mourning for a culture that would be lost. It's interesting that when Soloveitchik entertains the same ideas, he's writing in the 1940s when civilization is being lost, and perhaps more definitively, yet again. When Freud writes about melancholy, for him, and it's maybe an ideal that can never be reached, melancholy is, mourning is for Freud, is a healthy relationship to loss. Of course, loss and trauma can be just that, traumatic. But the question is it possible to move forward from loss? For me, the rabbis of the Talmud thematize this issue in relationship to questions of interpretation. And how they do that is describing, in many examples, the death of Moses. Moses dies, and in each one of the stories recounted in Tamura, Moses dies, and then laws are forgotten. Halachot are forgotten. So there's a relationship between mourning and loss. When Moses is no longer present, there are many other stories in which Yoshua is asked, recapture that loss for us. The answer to that in most cases is, Lo b'shamayim, God answers him, it's not in heaven, I gave it to you. For the rabbis considering Moses' death, the question of loss is whether it can be recuperated. For Freud, recuperation means going back into the past, but also being able to go into the future. A partial leave-taking of the past. That's Freud's language. I leave the past, but only partially. I'm still connected to it. In our terms, or Soloveitchik's terms, that's tradition. But I'm not so fixated on the past that I can't go forward. Partial leave-taking of the past to go into the future. People who only are in the future and repress the past never really get to mourn. So it's another version of unhealthy mourning. For the rabbis of the Talmud, the discussions of Moses and his death and loss are really about interpretation. Talmudic texts, Amoraim in relationship to Tanaim, the questions always are asked is, what does this mean? There's always a kind of lacuna, and a blank, an empty space. And from that comes multiplicity. Meaning, once I have a blank space, is the halacha like Rabbi Meir or Rabbi Yehuda? Now, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, they both have legitimate opinions. If they didn't both have legitimate opinions, then one of them would go away. There's something intrinsic about meaning, and this seems to be what the Gemara recognizes, which produces in the face of loss plural and multiple meanings. One of the stories about Moses' death is Moses dies, the laws are forgotten, and Othniel comes. Othniel is one of the judges. Othniel comes and he is able to recuperate the laws through pilpul, through dialectics. That is, through his own creative instincts, he's able to create the laws anew. And they're not necessarily the same exact laws that had been forgotten at the time of Moses. So that's the conception of healthy mourning, relating to loss and moving forward, going back into the past so one can go into the future. And this means, in my understanding of rabbinic mourning, that one is satisfied with only partial interpretations. Famous philosopher Hilary Putnam, was in Jerusalem, died recently, and he used to say, enough may not be everything, but enough is enough. And to me, that's a motto for rabbinic interpretation. Enough may not be everything, but enough is enough. That is, we talk about interpretations, or to put it in kind of a psychoanalytic idiom, there are good enough interpretations. There are never perfect interpretations. That's healthy mourning. For Freud, melancholy involves the inability to mourn healthily. There's still a desire for that lost object. The desire for that lost object, I'm speaking Freudian language, an object is person. The desire for the person who is lost is so great that one becomes inconsolable. And the only way for mourning for this traumatic experience of longing to be relieved is to find refuge in something else. I can't link up with the Shekhinah, as Rabbi Soloveitchik speaks of in a theological work. Freud will talk about his friend who has an oceanic feeling, a desire for union with the creation or the creator. Soloveitchik, for many reasons, sees that that's impossible. So instead of, in lieu of that kind of merging, Soloveitchik takes refuge in a kind of interpretation which is absolute. And we see in his later work that Soloveitchik will vacillate between two perspectives. Of course, Halakhic man, we know, Halakhic man is a man of conquest. We think of Rav Chaim, probably the model for Halakhic man. The noble, unflappable man of conquest, unruffled by emotion. Then think about Rabbi Soloveitchik in his late works. Goes in front of 2,000 people and he says, I am lonely. Celebrates his emotional life. Celebrates defeat. Now it's not conquest, but rather defeat that's important. Where the rabbis talk about interpretation, that's multiple. There are different perspectives. For Rabbi Soloveitchik, and I think this is where he takes a philosophical turn, a Kantian turn, a Cartesian turn, Soloveitchik in a way becomes an Enlightenment figure in the Jewish tradition. You either have everything, complete conquest, I know everything, or nothing. So there's a vacillation between total conquest, total meaning, and then complete desolation and desperation. When Rabbi Soloveitchik did...
I'm just going to pop in. I'm going to try and tie the threads together. So you have two terms here. Mourning, which is the capacity to let go. In other words, there's a loss, you can let it go, and in letting it go, you can move forward. And melancholy, which is the failure, in a sense, to let go. In other words, to be stuck. And I think that the connection you're making is that on a rabbinic level, Moses represents the kind of pure, perfect point of halakha. You don't have to argue, you don't have to dispute it. It is one. It is,
Right.
This is it.
Right.
But then he dies. So you lose it. You lose, in a sense, the one real connection to God. You lose the pure law. And what you're left with, all you're left with, is the ability to interpret. So the way you're analyzing the rabbis is that the rabbis are actually able to mourn successfully by letting go of the fantasy that we can get the pure halakha, the pure truth. And that's actually the genesis of interpretation, that once you let go of, I will never know the pure truth, you can allow yourself to now have multiple interpretations of things, so that there's an equation you're making between a healthy Freudian mourning, and you're actually saying that the rabbis exemplify that the act of interpretation is the sign that you've mourned successfully, because you're not stuck on, I want that truth back, and if I can't get it, I can't go forward. And they're able to actually move forward by letting go of that desire, that fantasy for absolute truth, and being able to interpret. Whereas melancholy, the stuck person, is the one who cannot console themselves about the loss of truth, and therefore, in a way, cannot open themselves up to multiple perspectives, because multiple perspectives, in a way, signify the loss of that absolute truth. What I'd like you to clarify a little bit is this connection between Rabbi Soloveitchik and melancholy. In what way is he stuck? In what way does his reflections on Judaism and Jewish law reflect the person who cannot move past it, who can't go forward?
Rabbi Soloveitchik tells a story which his editors kind of dismiss as a charming story about Rabbi Soloveitchik's childhood. He's in his grandfather's living room in a place called Pruzhna, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and his grandfather is Elliott Feinstein. His father is surrounded by Talmidim. He's described as Rabbi Moses in the book. And Rabbi Moses is stuck with an interpretive crux, something he can't solve. He starts to look despairingly at his Talmidim, pulls at his beard, and then miraculously the light shines, and he's able to solve the kasha, the question that the Rambam presents. Soloveitchik himself, sitting on a bed outside of this circle, and when Rabbi Moses solves the problem, everybody in the room is joyful. They're just jubilant. Interestingly, in the story, the young Joseph, as he describes himself, runs to his mother's room and says, "Father solved the problem of the Rambam." But as in the moment of emotional celebration, he goes to his mother. Again, total conquest, and the story is Rabbi Moses comes in the service of Rabbi Moses. Rabbi Moses Soloveitchik comes in the service of the Rambam, Maimonides, who is coming in the service of Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, and it's like an intergenerational conquest and triumph. That's one story. It's like a diptych, a painting diptych. The second story is, same scene, same kind of problem, but this time he fails. And the room falls into utter despair.
As Rabbi Soloveitchik's father fails to solve the Rambam problem.
Yeah, this time Rabbi Moses fails. And there's total desolation. Everybody is distraught. The young Joseph describes himself as sitting on his bed with Maimonides, and they're crying together. Instead of intergenerational triumph, it's intergenerational catastrophe. This time again, runs to his mother's room. She consoles him and says, "Don't worry, one day you'll grow up and maybe you'll solve the problems of your father." It's interesting that uncertainty in this story is located in the realm of the feminine. That is, for Soloveitchik, the masculine always is the realm of certainty. And when we don't have that certainty, there's despair and catastrophe. So why he's stuck is he's stuck again in this pendulum between the total conquest of full knowledge represented in the first half of the story and the absolute not knowing of the second half of the story. And the uncertainty that seems to be built into the legal process of Elu ve'elu divrim Elokim Chaim. When Rabbi Soloveitchik writes about interpretation, he never writes about that. Maybe once. I'm not talking about his practice. I'm not talking about what he did in the shiurim. When he writes about interpretation, he's not at all interested in pluralism. So it seems that he's stuck on this model of going back and forth. Was there something more you wanted to ask me
I
about
guess
that?
I'm curious.
Yeah.
You're arguing a kind of emotional, almost sort of psychoanalytic origin
Yeah.
for him getting stuck. He's so distraught at the idea that this problem can't be solved. In other words, he can't mourn the problem. He can't mourn the idea that we don't have an solution to the problem. I guess what you're saying in terms of Freudian mourning is that if he could mourn it, he could sort of would sanguinely accept the idea that we could have multiple possibilities and just leave it at that. Just leave open the idea of an open-ended interpretation to halakha.
Oh, which seems to be the way the Gemara works in most cases. And that may be the way many of his shiurim work.
But
Well, yeah.
the distress leads to the idea of, no, I have to stick with conquest. How does that manifest? I guess I'm thinking about examples in his work. You named one, that he doesn't seem to be attuned or doesn't seem interested in the Elu ve'elu argument in hermeneutics, but are there examples of halakhic decisions or philosophical comments that he makes that suggest that he's unable to let go of that kind of underlying fantasy to get back that pure truth or that pure presence?
You know, there's another story Rabbi Soloveitchik talks about being in the same room as Rabbeinu Tam and in Rashi. I think Rabbi Cardozo was talking about this also, a kind of idealized tradition away from the particularity of this worldly thought. I mean, I think all of his ethical writings are really based upon this sense of mourning and suffering. I mean, mourning or melancholy and suffering function really strangely in his work. In the story that I told you about Prujna, he's crying, he's weak, he's vulnerable. In other places, when he recounts his childhood, he's suffering, he's crying, he feels shame in front of his father, he feels that halakha is this burden that is painful. It's almost this language of masochism or sadism. Halakha being this terrible, terrible burden, this terrible suffering. And that in the context of his ancestors, who don't seem to relate at all to suffering. For example, the same Rav Eliyahu Feinstein, before his daughter is on her deathbed, and he runs and hastens to put on tefillin before she dies. It's really just told as this very cold, cold story. So in the context of that, Rabbi Soloveitchik is this young man running to his mother, feeling this emotional suffering. Later in his career, the very suffering that he experiences becomes a sign of chosenness. And in that way, I mean, part of my argument in relationship to Soloveitchik and maybe Freud is that in order for Soloveitchik to become himself, in some way he does have to kill his father off. Or he has to kill off the halakhic man and become a different version of that halakhic man. Soloveitchik models himself after Moses. In Soloveitchik's rendering, and I'm sure there's stuff in the Medrash about this, in Soloveitchik's representation, Moses is a man of suffering, feeling bereft, feeling bankrupt. An image of Moses like the great existential man at the bottom of his depression. And only because of that suffering does Moses merit revelation. For Soloveitchik himself, it's suffering, and this is again how he distinguishes himself from his ancestors, it's suffering that is the precondition for a certain kind of ethical thinking. So it's almost as if, and we haven't mentioned repentance, which I think is really central to Soloveitchik's thought. Repentance, I think the way Soloveitchik describes it, I mean, it's extremely complicated, he writes on a great deal, is a kind of a way of rewriting your own personal story. taking the facts of the past and rewriting them in a new narrative. I think that's just what he does in his later writing, is the suffering that was this desolation, this feeling of absolute loneliness and shame in relationship to his father, becomes for him later in his life a sign of chosenness. So this melancholy that he feels functions in different ways. In an ethical context, it becomes this sign of chosenness. And in a way, Soloveitchik's Moses is very much like Freud's Moses, an ethical man. It functions in another way, in an interpretive context, as never being satisfied. I never can get that lost object back, as he said. I can't get back to it. I long for it. I mean, the rabbis knew that the people of Israel would long for that pure meaning. In one of the stories, Moses dies, people of Israel go to Joshua, and they say, ask, and he won't do it. So they decide they're going to kill Joshua. Now, that's the Gemara. Freud said that the people of Israel wanted to kill Moses for giving them the law. The rabbis say that the people of Israel wanted to kill Joshua because he wouldn't be a replacement. We want another Moses. That the rabbis understood that we have this kind of fundamentalist urge. We want to go to that pure truth. And for Soloveitchik, because he can't have all, there's that melancholy feeling of nothingness. Again, it functions for him ethically in a different kind of way, as a sign of chosenness.
It strikes me that you're describing almost two people, right? You have one person, the Rabbi Soloveitchik of Halakhic man, who's working kind of, as Rabbi Cardozo alluded to before, meta-historically, right? I'm not going to acknowledge change. The halakha is kind of going to float above history, and I think you're seeing that as a form of stuckness, right? You're seeing that as a form of melancholy, that I can't let go of the idea of an absolute, unchanging truth, and I'm not going to give way to kind of pluralist interpretation. So that's like Rabbi Soloveitchik 1, if I understand you. But you're also saying that something happened to him in his life, where there was a change in later ethical writing in Ala Tshuva and Out of the Whirlwind, and so on, where, if not fully embracing mourning, he's allowing for a certain kind of change. Right, in Ala Tshuva, he's talking about a kind of flexibility of time where you can go back to your past, you can become a new person. There's a wonderful phrase from a scholar here in Israel, Mordechai Rotenberg, who talks about, I hope to have a good past, right, in which your present actions can rewrite how you even think about the past. That Rabbi Soloveitchik 2 that you're discussing seems more fluid, doesn't seem as stuck. Are you saying that in law he always remained melancholic, and with ethics and his personal meditations about change in one's life, he could move a little bit towards mourning?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's in both his writings about tshuva and then his writings about ethics, there is an acknowledgement of multiplicity. That is, when he writes in his ethical writings, when he's not writing in the realm of the halacha, when he's not writing in that masculine realm, when he embraces sometimes a feminine language. And interestingly, Rabbi Soloveitchik associates a certain kind of memory, quotes the French philosopher Bergson, a certain kind of memory is needed for the process of repentance. He calls it an event memory, a qualitative memory. There's another kind of memory, which Bergson calls a quantitative memory. And he says that the former, the qualitative memory, is both a blessing and a curse. And in his semi-autobiographical descriptions, he associates that memory, the qualitative memory, with his mother. And the quantitative memory, naturally, with the Halakhic man who sees the world through physical realms, with his father. It's just an interesting aside. But in the realm of ethics and also of tshuva, he represents what I would call multiple agencies. What do I mean by multiple agencies? In ethics, I mean, it's more obvious. there's the sense of the need to recognize the other. I'm sounding like Levinas now, right? The need to recognize the other. Example that Rabbi Soloveitchik gives, in Deuteronomy, there's the injunction to go to Jerusalem, to celebrate during the pilgrimage, and Rabbi Soloveitchik goes on to say, but of course there's the tithe that you have to give to the poor. At the very moment that you are celebrating, there is still the consciousness of the opposite emotion, the opposite perspective. There are people in need. T.S. Elliott said of 17th century poetry, or 17th century poets, that 17th century poets were able to see in one experience the possibility of other experiences. That is, this kind of multiplicity of perspectivism, which is the very thing that gets repressed in his writings about interpretation, he expands upon in his writing about ethics. And I would say really the same thing for tshuva. In order, as you said, to have a good past, there's a sense in which, there are two kinds of tshuva out of love and tshuva out of fear. Tshuva out of fear is, I just reject my past. I'm so disgusted by my past, I reject it. Maybe that's the tshuva, I think, implicitly in his work, which is associated with halachic men. Then the other kind of tshuva out of love, is, as you say, where I embrace my past. And I get into conversation with my past. I let my past speak, as it were. And that implies kind of agencies of the psyche. Sounds a lot like Freud, right? And Soloveitchik, Freud's famous comment is, where id was, ego will be. Where the past was, I will one day be. Soloveitchik has a very, very similar sense. That is, I will my present self will be transformed by the past. But again, in order to have a nice past, I have to let that past speak. So there's that sense of more than one agency. An agency of whatever Freudian metaphors you could use, an agency of my past, however derelict and horrible it is. That's tshuva. There's the tshuva out of fear, in which I just say I have nothing to do with that. Tshuva out of love is, I think this is for Soloveitchik, his most compelling, obviously, for him, is where you rewrite the past, allowing it to speak in a different way. So there becomes a kind of interpsychic dialogue between the parts of the psyche.
So once the mourner allows the past to speak, in other words, let's say you suffer a great loss.
Right.
So the unhealthy model would be, you never want to talk about it, you never want to think about it again, it's banished, but it isn't really banished. It goes
Well, that's one. The other one is, all I can do is talk about it.
Or all I can do is talk about it. I can never get past it,
Right.
either by never talking about it, by always talking about it.
Which are the
So
same
that's-
thing, really.
So that's the melancholic, right? The
Right.
person who's stuck either by never identifying or just obsessing about it always, right? You seem to be arguing that up to a certain point in his life, that's him, and the way we know that's him is because of the way he writes about law. The fact that he writes about law in this kind of above history way, a kind of static way, you're positing is suggesting almost the personality of the melancholic who can never get past, who can never allow things to evolve and change, and this gets manifested legally. What I'm interested then is that you are arguing, though, that at a certain point in his life, some sort of mourning, if we define mourning as allowing things to be a little bit more fluid, I can move a bit, enters. I'm wondering, is there an historical point? In other words, is there a point where this mastery of cognition gives way? You do mention in the book that he has a medical problem and an operation in the late 1950s. And I'm wondering if this kind of what you call humility, he enters into a kind of phase of epistemological humility. Is the halakha defeated by life at that point? In other words, was this a crisis? Is there now a later Soloveitchik that comes into view because of this personal suffering? And because of this personal suffering, he's able to let go a little bit of that being stuck model?
Before I answer the question you just asked, I want to just go back a second to explaining a little bit the frustration of mourning. There's a French critic of the 70s, Julie Kristeva, who talks about not being able to lose. And Soloveitchik, I think, falls into that category, not knowing how to lose. And in the face of loss, Kristeva writes, there's an attempt at compensation. And that compensation she terms the law, and by law she means culture, art, also law. That since I can't have the thing I really want, I compensate for it in other ways, through language. For Kristeva, she writes that compensation is never enough. It's never sufficient. There's always that longing for the thing that I can't have. And I think that's true of Soloveitchik as well. And this is the ambivalence of Soloveitchik as Halakhic man. For Soloveitchik, Kristeva's law is the halacha. And in some sense, it really never is enough. There's always that desire for something else. There's always that desire for something out there, represented, I think, again, in the feminine, in what the warmth it offers, the emotion it offers.
Which means what? In other words, you're saying there's something that can never be compensated for. It's the pure origin thing. It's like when people say, if I can't have God, you know, everything else is a substitution.
Right.
For him, what's the thing that got lost? And what's the thing he stuck?
I think in his own philosophical language, it's really pure presence.
God.
Immanence, the immanence of God. And maybe that's because he learned with Chabad. I mean, immanence versus transcendence. Is God immanent or transcendent? Soloveitchik would love to embrace the immanent God. He would love to be Spinoza, but he can't because it raises lots of ethical problems. Meaning once you embrace immanence, once you embrace an idea that God is in everything, it raises problems of, well, you know, what is the locus of morality? Where does law come from? So I think that's his desire for that purity. And he can never have it. Now, you asked before about what brings him back to life. And I think it is that sense of mortality. At a point in the footnotes of Halakhic Man, which I read, he talks about Rudolf Otto, German philosopher, and something that he calls the trace of the divine. That there's something that the Halakhic man cannot account for. There's something outside of his interpretive matrix. And that is just, I guess, he talks about an out-of-the-whirlwind mystery. The sublime, the things that are beyond language. I think maybe that's perhaps one way of thinking about Soloveitchik, is there is a sense maybe of mortality, but also a sense of the sublimity or the mystery of life, things that cannot be included in the matrix of the Halakhic man. There are things beyond it. I mean, he always says that. Even in his early writings, there's always a sense there's something else there. There's something else behind it, which he can't get to. And that becomes more acute, I think, in his later writings, which is, I think, a great way of putting it. It's a kind of epistemological humility.
So the not being able to get to it. I can't get to God.
Yeah.
God is lost. I'm curious whether, is it that God was there and got lost, or God is always never present? And I'm mourning the fact that, and I think this is a feeling that many people have, like all the time, which is this feeling you do Jewish life, you do mitzvot, you learn, but underneath it all, there's this vague suspicion of what's underneath it. Is there anything underneath it? Because, you know, we don't see God, we don't touch God, we don't hear from God unless we're crazy. And there's this feeling of this dissonance of, I'm anxious about that. I want to believe that this all adds up to something, but what if it doesn't? And what if underneath there is no presence there? And are you saying that inchoate feeling was so internalized in him that there was a kind of compensation? If I can't get God, I'm going to make this halakha so pure and so strict and so unstinting that it is the thing that is going to try and compensate for that.
Even though it never fully does.
Right, and it's interesting because his son's Chaim Soloveitchik, at the end of his really celebrated essay, Rupture and Reconstruction, says almost exactly the same thing. I'm going to read to you a passage from that because it's so apropos, right? The Reb's son, Dr. Chaim Soloveitchik, writes an article in 1994 called Rupture and Reconstruction, in which he tries to account for the orthodoxy that he sees today, a kind of stricter kind of orthodoxy. He recalls that in previous generations, people learned how to be Jewish by looking at their parents, by being at home. And now people learn it out of books. And books are always stricter. Books always default to the strictest position. And he goes into a very, very dense detail about this and concludes with the following. He says, I think it is safe to say that the perception of God as a daily natural force is no longer present to a significant degree in any sector of modern Jewry, even the most religious. It is this rupture in traditional religious sensibilities that underlies much of the transformation of contemporary Orthodoxy. Zealous to continue traditional Judaism unimpaired, religious Jews seek to ground their new emerging spirituality less on a now unattainable intimacy with God than on an intimacy with his will. Having lost the touch of his presence, they seek now solace in the pressure of his yoke.
Yeah,
And that's how the essay ends. And it's striking me here, kind of like father, like son.
Yeah.
I don't, are you arguing that that's in a way how the Rav felt, that there was always this feeling that something's gone or never was?
Right. I mean, there's so many things you've said are so suggestive. The pleasures of the yoke. I mean, to me, the lady doth protest too much.
It's the pressure of the yoke.
Oh, the pressure of the yoke.
Yeah, not the pleasure.
For Soloveitchik, it's sometimes the pleasure. The pleasure and the incomplete compensation. I'm sorry.
I guess what I'm asking is that, in a sense, what he does and what we do in Jewish life is
Right.
we use this kind of law and
Right.
strictness of law as
Right.
a way of covering over the fact that
Well, I would just change his terms a little bit. And this, I mean, I think he's speaking as a brisker, the law, the chok. I think if I were to do a contemporary analysis of the Jewish world, which is not what I'm here for, but I'll do it anyway, it's not just the halacha. There's halacha on the one side, so everybody's in the Haredi world in a halacha called learning halacha. But then there's the other side, which is the mysticism. Meaning, and there's this kind of crazy extreme mysticism on the one hand, and then the other hand is this dry halacha, and they don't really meet at any place. But I think the question you're asking, which is to me an interesting one, is this phenomenon, is it melancholy moderns, or are we always in this position of being melancholy? I just was teaching Paradise Lost this afternoon, and Adam and Eve getting thrown out of Eden, and right before they leave, the archangel Michael says to them that even though God, you're not going to walk in the garden with God anymore, but when you go out into the world, God will be as here. It's a lovely. It's kind of like the birth of language and signification and interpretation. God is as here and present through his signs. Now, for Milton, whatever, 300 years ago, that was enough. The signs themselves are enough. For Soloveitchik, that doesn't seem ever to be enough, right? And so I think there's a kind of particular melancholy that comes in the 20th century. Figures like Walter Benjamin as well. This sense of kind of, I give up on the mystics, so I have to rely upon the compensation of stories, law, language, whatever.
is he self-conscious about the substitution? By that I mean, you recognize it as a sign and you're self-conscious that it's a sign, right? You're opening up the Torah, you're reading it, it's supposed to be the sign of God, but the very fact that it's the Torah and not God proves to you that it's a sign, right? Like,
it's immediate.
this is what Emily Bronte writes about gravestones, that when you're at the gravestone, you're there supposedly to be, this is the person, but of course it's not the person, because it's the stone. The sign itself proves that presence is not here, right? Derrida says the sign is always a sign of the fall, meaning that in Eden, Adam had God. But after Eden, all we have are signs of God. We don't have God, right? So is he aware of the signification that the law and all that comes with it is a proof that God is not actually there? Or are you just making that argument and he's not so self-conscious?
Well, I don't know. I mean, according to what consolation would we get out of signs? I mean, Soloveitchik talks when he writes about quantum physicists who are kind of the heroes of Halakhic mind. He says that even they feel this kind of despair that their concepts are only concepts and are somehow removed from the reality that they're trying to describe. So there he is, self-consciously or not, describing that sense of distance. It's interesting that his ancestor, Rav Chaim of Volozhin, has maybe the same kind of ideas about knowledge and being, meaning Chaim of Volozhin, he adopts the ontology, conceptions of being from the Kabbalists, all the Sfirot. But he says ultimately, you can't really know them. Meaning there's this ontology, there is this world, and you can't really know them, so you can't have access to them, so we rely upon concepts or signs. Rav Chaim of Volozhin is to me, this exuberant thinker, celebrating the individual. 200 years later, you got Rabbi Soloveitchik, and he's got the same kind of worldview about knowledge, and he's in absolute despair. So maybe there is something historically specific about, personally specific, historically specific about the kind of melancholy, the kind of absence that we feel in the 21st century or the 20th century.
Well, so if we extrapolate from that, all Jews, everybody in this room, everybody in the Jewish world, essentially has to decide between mourning and melancholy. In other words, if you're a person who finds the absence of God inconsolable, I can't do this religion thing if I don't have God in my living room, right? Everything, it's just a sham. It's just all substitution, and I can't let go of that. And in a way, you're in a melancholic state, in a sense, of whether you can actually embrace religion, whereas the mourner, in a way, accepts the compensation, right?
Yes.
Right. What does Freud say about the melancholic? He can't chew the food,
Right.
like as a substitution for loss. And so you have to be able to chew the religious food in order to accept the fact that God's not here. But what we have is we have Torah, we have mitzvah, we have community, we have everything else, but we don't have the thing. Can I live Jewishly without that thing there?
Well, I mean, I go back to Milton. It's a little bit like going when they get thrown out of Eden, they are left with signs, and if they're going to live, they're going to have to interpret it. And in Milton, there's a certain kind of satisfaction, obviously, with the sign. And the question is, how much consolation do we get from that? If we want from the sign everything, well, we'll never be happy. And my argument about mourning rabbis is that they were, in fact, they were comfortable with the consolations of the sign. They were comfortable with the consolations of good enough interpretations in the plural.
Was Halakha not meant originally to be the way how to draw God into our day-to-day life? Was that not the ultimate purpose behind it, which got lost in a later stage?
Right, but what you celebrate, I think, is actually quite disappointing if you think about it. If you think about pluralism, what it really means, it could be this and it could be that. If you're living a life where you want to know, what is it really? What is it really? You don't want this and that. You don't want elu ve'elu. You don't want the law could be this, the law could be that. If the law is a reflection of divine will, I don't want maybe this, maybe that. So what is that God? You want that capital T truth. Now, I think there's a kind of post facto accommodation, right? I see pluralism almost as a post facto accommodation to the loss of presence. And as such, we celebrate it, right? But does anybody in their right mind really not want the real thing? Unless the real thing is so overwhelming that really you don't want it, right?
That's also true. I mean,
Right.
Soloveitchik, when he does imagine the real thing,
It's scary.
It's scary, and the feminine is promising, but also it threatens to be overwhelming. But I don't know. I mean, yeah, we do want the real thing, but maybe there's a consolation of something like the virtual Beit Midrash. Somebody said that. It's not my coinage. The virtual Beit Midrash in which we relate to each other and we look at truth as a communal enterprise, as something that that's really what the ideal yeshiva should be. When we're in this, as Milton says, the process of adding truth to truth. Milton says, again, I'm a Miltonist, he says, he who thinks we are to pitch our tent here, he who thinks we have already arrived, that person is far from the truth. I think that's what Chazal think. If you say you have the truth, you're far from the truth. Why? Because truth by definition is something that can only be collectively known. I mean, I need to be in conversation with others. So, I mean, I understand what you're saying. The fundamentalist urge is strong, but I think there are more consolations of pluralism.
But he's ironically then kind of in conflict with the Talmudic rabbis. There's something remarkably ironic about
that's why I couldn't write the book that I wanted to write, because I wanted to write a book about, there's this neat continuity between ancient and modern rabbis, the modern rabbi being Soloveitchik, and I found, no, it's rupture.
Is God not a pluralist?
I don't have to ask him.
In the way how he appears within the Jewish tradition, with all the contradictions.
Right.
And is that indeed not possible to live by that?
God's not anything. There's no there. Humans project a pluralism in the face of that loss, which is fine. I think it's actually a very logical maneuver, and we celebrate it. And communities construct it. Before we throw it open to the floor,
which we probably
I
should
did
do.
want to ask you just a little historical question, because you talked about, Freud mourning civilization in the First World War, the Rav mourning civilization in the Second World War. There's also the accompanying historical timeline of what I call the kind of background hum of modernity, which is this idea of the loss of God, right? From from Blake really to Nietzsche, right through the 20th century, there's this feeling that God is not there, that there's no presence. And I'm wondering if you feel that Rabbi Soloveitchik isn't just responding to kind of mosaic loss, but the feeling all around him that the culture sort of pushing this idea that God isn't here anymore.
Right.
And is he in kind of heroic resistance to that?
I think that's a great question. It's something I have to think more about. I think maybe part of it is a result of 17th century philosophy. Figures like Hobbes, a figure like Spinoza, this kind of 17th century obsession with being, which is new. A philosophical language in which I want to have access to being in some sense. And I think that holds out philosophically that promise. The short answer to your question is really, I don't know, and it's something I really think about. Is Soloveitchik part of just this project of modernity? How much is it specific to where he's coming from? I think that's a great question. So maybe we should.
Just one question which I would like to ask you is, does the Holocaust not play a tremendous role here without being mentioned? In other words, the incredible emphasis on halakha is basically to run away from the Holocaust and its theological problems which we cannot solve. So we are replacing our problems somewhere else. Let's make another halakhic problem, so we don't need to deal with the issue of religion or faith in God and trust in God after something like that.
I mean, you can't really blame. I mean, in a way, you can't blame him, right? I mean,
There's nothing to blame.
You mentioned. I'm just saying that the trauma is so new. I mean, you were talking before about Rabbi Sax's hesped of Rabbi Soloveitchik, and he talks about the centrality of the Holocaust and that feeling of loss in his work. And he talks about Rabbi Soloveitchik as, again, as you're saying, coming to America, or you're saying, and kind of heroically continuing the tradition, and being a kind of first rabbi in America, which I'll just say begs the question. Rabbi Cardozo referred to the title of my book, which is The Last Rabbi. And the reason I call him the last rabbi, and not the first rabbi as Rabbi Sachs is because Rabbi Soloveitchik, I think, imagined himself as this very, very lonely figure, obviously. And just like he sees himself as a mirror of Moses, in other places as a mirror of Abraham, he reads all of the Avot through this lens of absolute, utter despair and loneliness. I lost my train of thought. You want to help me out here?
I have that moment every day, most of the day.
Yeah. Why not the first rabbi and why the last rabbi? Because Rabbi Soloveitchik confessed in an article in the 50s that he did not feel he was a good rabbi to his students, that he did not convey the warmth that a rabbi in Israel should convey. And I think that Rabbi Soloveitchik so embraced the idea of being in the Chadesh, not in halacha, but as a person, that he created, or it's like he created a tradition that couldn't be continued. I mean, I know if there are any Talmidim of the Rav here, they'll tell you probably he had no idea what he was doing with the philosophers. He used to go uptown to whatever. He used to go downtown to Columbia to talk to the philosophers. We had no idea what he was doing. Meaning there was a separation between what he did in Shir and what he did outside of Shir. And I think it's crucial that he says, I couldn't convey warmth to my students. And that's again this emphasis on the feminine, that he became so idiosyncratic that he had no Talmidim. Just like Moses, just like Elisha at the end of One Man of Faith. Just a figure who's so individuated that he doesn't have any true followers. I don't know if he's criticizing his followers or criticizing himself. I don't know.
I'm going to be throwing it open to the floor now.
A
A couple of ground rules. Number one, speak loudly and clearly, and make it a question, and make it succinct, please. But before that, I'd like you to all give Professor Kolbrener a warm hand. Would you stand and... Yeah. Go ahead.
So much of what we've heard, everything of what we've heard, most of what's been written has been the Rav Soloveitchik of Yeshiva University. Nobody ever talks about the Rav Soloveitchik of Boston. And the fact is that my conception, what I've heard is totally opposite of what you just said. He was warm. He did have a community. And he did have people who loved him very much, not respect.
Okay, I mean, I would just emphasize that I'm not a biographer. I didn't know Rabbi Soloveitchik. I'm interested in his representations. That's what I mean. How does he represent interpretation? How does he represent ways of knowing? I'm happy and ready to learn from all of the students of Rabbi Soloveitchik about his life. But I'm stuck with his writings. So that's what I'm basing what I wrote on. So I'm grateful for your comment. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Yes. Stand, please.
You mentioned the Holocaust, and you
Yeah.
mentioned the Chantiers. You said he was from Isha Halakha, he went then came ethics. I wonder to what extent Israel played a role in that as well. I think of Kolbrener, where he talks about how he changed he came from a background, a very Haredi background, anti-Zionist, and then moved, and he recognized Yehud, etc. And I wonder what role that may have played.
That's very interesting. I mean, and also in Kol Dofek, he gives his own theodicy. The theodicy is justifying the ways of God to man. That's Milton. And it's a very weak theodicy. It's a brisk theodicy, which is, I don't know. And he says, I can't, and of course, probably people know here that Rabbi Soloveitchik says you can't ask the why question, that is, why do men suffer, but rather the what question. And maybe that's related to your insight that in the face of the Holocaust, you ask not why did this happen, but what can I do? And part of what can I do is helping establish the state of Israel.
The truth about it is that Rav Soloveitchik was a Haredi. In his attitude towards many things, he was a Haredi, but he was a Zionist at the same time, which made him an exceptional situation, put him in an exceptional situation. But in his thinking, he was very much part of the Haredi world.
Your last few words are a little puzzling. I think I heard you say that he didn't have any followers.
I didn't say that.
Oh, you didn't say that.
Students.
Huh?
Students.
So let
Say what you said.
No,
again.
so I mean, the gentleman in the back pointed out that in Boston, he was surrounded by people and surrounded by students. And I'm sure if some of his students were here, they would object even more vigorously than you did. Again, I'm interested not in...
I didn't object, I'm just
It's fine. I'm not taking it personally. I'm not. I just said I'm not a biographer. I don't know. I never met him. I'm interested in his writings. Like I said before, I think that's part of the advantage is that he represents himself in his writings as a failure. Why is that? That's the question I ask.
I mean,
I'm not going to say, well, in real life he was something different. Okay. Yeah.
You did say it,
Yeah.
but I think you meant something by it. In other words, I think you meant that in terms of a true student, nobody really was able to incorporate that kind of emotional and historical complexity and in the sense of really being unique in the sense of the way he was unique. In other words, they were followers perhaps, but not
This is exactly
really
what Norman
students,
Lamb told
you
me.
know. So I think that's what you meant.
They didn't love him, or they
Well, I don't think it was about yes, sir, please.
The Rav writes in Mourning and Melancholia, he pretty explicitly describes the loneliness he's describing as not anything that could be described by Freud as a subjective psychological state, but rather some objective existential aspect of the universe, as it were.
So what's the question?
Question is, it seems to me that the Rav would disagree with your interpretation.
I'm
of
sure
the
he
Rav.
will. I think part of my argument is that I'll say two things. Maybe you would disagree, but the Rav's project is deeply influenced by Freud. That is, whenever the Rav in Halakhic Man is talking about desire, he's saying, I recognize the same desires that Freud does, and I'm going to show not how they lead to, in the Rav's mind, degradation, but how they can be sublimated, how they can be picked up, how they can better be, not the Freudian term, how they can be elevated. So I would say that Freud is very much on Rav Soloveitchik's mind. I would also say that the essay Mourning and Melancholia is very much on Rabbi Soloveitchik's mind, and he writes explicitly against that argument without naming the argument. And to me, it's another case of the lady doth protest too much. that, I mean, the argument is too complicated for me to describe now. It is something that I deal in with my book. I think that 1932, Rabbi Soloveitchik arrives in Boston. That's the year Freud and Einstein are having a correspondence about peace. The next month, Einstein is moving to Princeton. The next 2 months, Hitler is coming to power. It's impossible that Soloveitchik was unaware of Freud's presence, and I think there's a case to be made very strongly that he's really reacting to him.
In disagreement.
Yes, in disagreement. I think Soloveitchik misunderstands Freud in some ways, but that's again an argument in the book. But yes, I think most people in the yeshiva world, and not only YU graduates, would find the invocation of Freud to be problematic and troubling, and I understand that. But to me, it's a useful lens.
Do you think that there's a fundamental problem with the obsession that modern day yeshivot have with learning the Rav and the brisk method that might lead to might be drawn into a melancholic way and bar question and
I always wondered when I first came to yeshiva. I thought, wow. And I told you I was in graduate school and was really interested in pluralism, and I thought I go to Beis Medrash and all these guys are arguing with each other. And you would think that would have, like the Gemara in Kedushin says, that learning is a refuah, that it helps people individually and communally. And I thought, wow, this is exactly what I'm looking for, this communal Beit Midrash. And yet, everybody I knew there had fundamentalist ideas about truth. I think that has very much to do with this brisk conception of learning. That somehow even though the whole process is just that, a process, that dynamic somehow doesn't translate in people's heads.
Sure.
From outside the yeshiva world, one of the criticisms of YU, as I understand it, and perhaps Soloveitchik because he was one of the founders, is that they compartmentalize their mind.
They're bifurcated. That's
That's
the
another
word.
way of putting
Right.
it. There's modernism, I think
Right.
you were referring to, and there's tradition. And it's very hard to really synthesize the two. Do you think maybe this is what led to his melancholy? And isn't this one of the major problems of modern Orthodoxy?
I think that's what led to his Talmidim's melancholy, because Soloveitchik is performing a kind of synthesis, which I don't even know if it is synthesis. He's just using his brain, and his brain has been exposed to jillions of different things. And I think, as Norman Lamb says, Torah Mada, which is just like a slogan. Now it's just a slogan for like an economic lifestyle, but Torah Mada is a risky business, right? It's risky, and those who talk about synthesis, I think synthesis is understood through the lens of the Halakhic man as man of conquest, meaning we can know everything. I teach Milton and other stuff. It's not so easy to synthesize, right? It's a lot of work. Let's have our 8th graders read Romeo and Juliet. Seriously? I mean, it's a play about sex and violence. I'm just saying that there are risks involved in, people who talk about synthesis glibly whitewash Western culture. It's challenging. Does things that are difficult. Maybe just one more. Yeah?
Soloveitchik was really innovative in, let's say, 3 areas, namely Zionism,
Women's learning,
and secular studies.
There you go.
Those things were so big.
I agree.
They were a break from his family, so
Yeah.
maybe he wasn't innovative in other ways because it was such a big thing to do just that.
I think Rabbi Cardozo was the locus of that argument, not me so much.
I would agree with that. He was hiding somewhere behind certain forms of fundamentalism to allow the other things to take place without getting too much into trouble.
Just want a closing note. First of all, I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank Rabbi Cardozo, as always, for hosting this evening. I want to thank my colleagues at Torah in Motion for helping support the evening. If you're interested more in the work we do, please check out our website. We are actually offering trips now around the world, which are fantastic trips. So if you go on the website, look at Torn Motion Summer Trips, and I think they'll be of great interest. And last but not least, of course, I want to really thank my friend Bill Kolbrener for a really engaging evening. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.